Back here in the studio, Erin Ogunke is joining us here on set. The French papers today, Erin, really dominated, of course, by the death of the former president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Just managed to get this into the papers, didn't they? It broke after 11 o'clock at night here in France last night.
Yeah, that's right, Stuart. He succumbed to the coronavirus at 94 years of age, as you say, late yesterday. So his death is unsurprisingly the cover of most French papers this Thursday morning. Aujourd'hui en France, the Daily choosing a photo from his younger years and remembering him as a reformer. Now, the headline of right-wing paper, Le Figaro, remembers Valéry Giscard d'Estaing as an exceptionally gifted man. The paper describes him as a centrist, a liberal, pro-European who was both unappreciated and widely misunderstood. For this piece, for above all, he was an exceedingly talented politician. Now, the Daily, Le Parisien, focuses on one of those perceived talents, and that is the way that he revolutionized political communication. I think it's interesting to read that Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was fascinated by John F. Kennedy, was really impressed by his allure with the public. And so at the time, he was the youngest president to take office and really made a point of trying to better relate to French citizens. Among some of his most famous attempts to do so, wearing a sweatshirt to a TV interview instead of the more classic suit and tie, even appearing shirtless after participating in a football meeting. And I think one of these photos on the right here really sums this whole idea up, which is that he had invited street cleaners to have dinner with him at the Élysée Palace. So we're kind of used to seeing today politicians, mostly Vladimir Putin, shirtless and doing things that a lot of us, that a lot of regular people do. At the time, this was really new.
Yeah, interesting to see how things have changed, isn't it? Other French papers, though, they're not shying away, are they, from reminding us about some of the less glorious aspects, shall we say, of his presidency?
Yeah, that's right. There is some nuance to be made. For the left-leaning paper Libération, on the one hand, as we've seen in stories earlier, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing embodied modernity. Now that, of course, is because of the major societal reforms that took place under his mandate, including the liberalization of laws on divorce, on abortion, and on contraception. But this paper's editorial on his death also remembers his presidency as one that was marked by severely neoliberal economic policies and also a wave of mass unemployment following the 1973 oil crisis. Now, these, of course, are crises that paved the way for the left to be reelected after his 7 years in office. Le Monde published a piece exploring his widely criticized relationship with African dictatorships. More specifically, the paper focuses on what it describes as the biggest scandal to rock his 7 years in office, and that is the Diamonds Affair. Now, in 1974, a French satirical paper revealed that the then French president had accepted 30 carats in diamonds from Bokassa I, the extravagant military dictator of the Central African Republic. For many, this was the final straw that kind of led to his failed re-election campaign in 1981.
Let's keep looking beyond France. Many European papers, they're focusing really on his dedication to the European Union, aren't they?
Yes, I'll start with the center-right German paper, Frankfurter Allgemeine, which recalls his, quote, special friendship with German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, saying the unification of Europe and the Franco-German relationship were part of his life's work. They're pictured there. Together, the two of them conceived of the European monetary system and helped found the summit meetings for the world's major economic powers, which started with the G6 at the time. Now, Spanish paper El País similarly describes him as the promoter of the European ideal. The Spanish paper noting that his own personal experience in fighting in the resistance in World War II means he, quote, knew in his own flesh the price of tearing Europe apart. I think it's interesting to mention also that El País is one of the only papers I have seen to mention that Giscard d'Estaing was accused by a German journalist in 2018 of groping. A lot of French papers preferring to describe him simply as somebody who was a charmer up until the very end of his life.
Finish up. Let's look at how he's being remembered outside of the European Union.
Yes, I'll start with the UK's Financial Times, which, interestingly enough, coming out of the UK, looks at one of his perceived failures with respects to European integration. The paper reminding readers that though he did chair a convention that ultimately drafted the Constitution for the European Union well after his mandate ended in the early 2000s, the Constitution 3 years later was rejected here in France, his very own home country. The paper calls out his uncompromising view on the French rejection of that treaty, concluding that it's a small wonder that he was sometimes sometimes criticized as haughty and elitist. In the United States, the New York Times, American paper, remembers him for seeking to limit the American influence in Europe. He says that Europeans loved Americans but just don't want to be dominated by them. I think it's interesting, especially knowing about a lot of the debates that are happening in the United States today, to say that the New York Times is the only paper, Stuart, to remind readers that he warned in the early 90s, so again in his later years, that France would be eventually facing an invasion of immigrants. He also suggested that French citizenship should be conferred as a blood right, which the New York Times says was borrowed from neo-fascists. So one of the parts of his later years that we don't often hear about.
Yeah, good to delve a little deeper, shall we say, into the life of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Thanks very much, Erin Agunke, there with the newspapers here on France 24.